Hi and welcome back to the studio, and this video is going to be about the song 7,000 Miles from the album 9 Lives. And I thought I'd mix things up a bit this time, and instead of doing two separate videos, one about lyrics and one about studio technique, I'd put them both together because the lyrics kind of speak for themselves, so I don't need to say much about them, and then we can dive into the technical stuff. So at first listen, you could be fooled into thinking this is a song about a long-distance relationship. And it is kind of, but it's not a loving relationship. It's about war. And I wrote the song after reading interviews with drone pilots. I don't mean the little helicopter drones, but the Reaper and Predator drones that have been used by the military to attack targets in countries like Afghanistan. Each drone is manned remotely by a pilot and a sensor operator, and these young ground-based air officers study their targets carefully for weeks, learning their background and their routines. They watch them and their families closely and really get to know every detail of their lives. They work out where they'll be and who they'll be with at any given time before killing them from the safety of another country about 7,000 miles away. Now, many of these pilots come to understand that what they do is actually murder, and some go on to develop post-traumatic stress when faced with the reality of that fact. So if you want to read the article that inspired this song, there's a link to it in the description down below. So what of the production techniques? The song begins with wind noises, and I wanted this to segue from the icy wind effects at the end of Green Boots and have them sort of turn into some kind of wind rushing past the cockpit type sounds. When mastering for vinyl or CD, running one track into the next is quite simple. But mastering for downloads is slightly different because it's not really possible to do that unless you join the two tracks together to make one longer track. But then what do you call the one track that's actually two songs? In my own experience, today's download and streaming audiences have shorter attention spans anyway, so halfway through the first song they might decide to skip the track or switch off and never hear the second song. So it's not simple anymore. Anyway, I decided to fade out one track and fade the next one in, establishing the wind outside the cockpit sounds, although that's erroneous because drones don't actually have a cockpit. I added some low throbbing synth sounds to represent aircraft noise. Drones are supposed to be pretty silent, but I think it helps to set the scene. So to get the wind noise, I used Steinberg's Retrolog synthesizer, which is kind of a model of an analog synth, and it's really just white noise going through the filter section. So that's being swept up and down by a very low frequency oscillator there, and that goes through the delay on the way out and creates that wind noise. The other synth I've used is Steinberg's Pad Shop, which is a granular synth, and that sounds like this and creates that sort of aircraft engine noise passing overhead. And there's also some noise with a faint 2.4 kilohertz sine wave in there as well. So the three of them together provide that wind rushing past the cockpit sound. In addition to that, there's a sound called Chopper, produced by an excellent synth plugin called Alpha 3 that's made by Linplug and was available in free and paid for versions. And the free version can still be found floating around on the web, although Linplug don't actually appear to exist anymore, presumably because the free version was so good that nobody bought the paid version. So I used this to produce a low-pitched sound using a slightly detuned sawtooth waves, and then chopped that up using a square wave LFO to make the sort of beat sound rather like a helicopter. Though, as I've said, this kind of drone is not a helicopter. And the final sound was passed through a flanger, which gives it the sort of shifting quality of sound that we associate with the noise of an aircraft passing overhead. And the reason aircraft sound like that is because the direct sound from the aircraft also reflects off the atmosphere, and off the ground in certain frequencies cancel each other out, and physics really. To add to the atmosphere of the track, I decided to add some radio chatter, and I needed to have American accents, and although I could have faked an American accent, there are many different American accents, and I'm not sure how convincing I would have sounded. Also, I needed more than one voice. So what I did was to type some gibberish words that sounded like navigation and targeting chat into two different text-to-speech converters and chose different voices for different phrases. And then I put everything together onto these two tracks with slightly different effects chains to create a convincing call and response pilot-to-ground radio conversation. So if we just listen to the radio chat on its own to begin with.
You hit the zone in 23.
On my mark.
3,000.
Maintain 1,000.
Okay, so it sounds a bit poor. So I've processed this by using different types of distortion. And I've started off with one called the quadrafuzz, which splits the signal into four different frequency bands, and then you can apply different amount of distortion to each frequency band. So you can see it's distorting at the high frequencies and less at the lower frequencies. That sounds okay, but then after that we've got a thing called the bit crusher, which kind of produces digital distortion by dividing that down to 7.4 bits instead of the 16-bit audio. After that we've got just an ordinary distortion plugin which kind of clips the signal. And then finally I'm using a thing called a comb filter, which is kind of what flanging is. It uses delay to knock out certain frequencies by interference. The other one has slightly different effects. Again, it's got the quadrafuzz, providing the same sort of high frequency distortion, and it's also got the standard distortion that's just doing the clipping. It's got a saturator, which it kind of emulates the kind of distortion you get from valves or from tape, and then it's got the track plug doing EQ and compression. So I wanted to make it sound like voices were coming from different places. Although this is completely inaccurate because, of course, these are drones and the pilot and the ground controller are sitting in the same room somewhere in Nevada. There is no radio chat between an unmanned aircraft and anyone anywhere, but it all helps to set the scene. As that's all going on, we start to hear a synth part fading in underneath, playing a little arpeggio pattern, which again is an instance of Steinberg's Retrolog synth. But to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm controlling it using a piece of hardware, and this is actually a Korg MS2000 synth, which kind of does the same thing, but I'm able to map the controls on the hardware synth to the software synth. So for example, if I turn the cutoff control here, you see the cutoff control moves on the software synth, likewise resonance, and I think I've got distortion mapped down here as well. So when I play that, I can tweak it in real time. And you may wonder why I don't just use the Korg synth as it is. And the simple answer is, unless there's a specific sound on a specific hardware instrument that I just can't get any other way, it's just easier to control everything in software.
Tomorrow I'll be with you. Tonight I'm gonna fly. I'll be there in the morning.
Now, there's a strummed rhythm guitar underneath that vocal, and I wanted it to sound fairly thin in the first verse, so I could fatten it up in verse 2. Now, I'd already recorded some acoustic guitars when I read a little known fact about the Paul Simon track Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, which was produced by Phil Ramone, and he had wanted a very light rhythm guitar sound. So some of it was played on electric guitars which were unplugged and recorded acoustically with microphones, and I added some of that technique to verse 1. And underneath that there are also some acoustic guitars playing strummed chords. So that's it for this video. Not quite everything for this song, but we'll have a look at that in another video. Hope you enjoyed that anyway, and see you soon. Stay safe. Bye for now.